Hey, I've been lurking here for a while, but after what happened to me a few months ago, I figured I'd share my story. It's not supernatural or anything like that, but it was hands down the scariest experience of my life. It still makes me paranoid to be home alone at night. This happened on a Friday night. I live alone in a small house at the end of a quiet street. It's not completely isolated. I've got neighbors, but their houses are spaced pretty far apart. That night it was pouring rain. You know the kind of rain where it's so loud on the roof you can barely hear yourself think? I love the sound of rain, so I didn't mind. I was curled up on the couch with a blanket, watching Netflix, just trying to unwind from the week. Around 11 p.m., I thought I heard something over the rain. At first, I brushed it off as the storm, but then I heard it again. A distinct knock. It was coming from my front door. I paused my show and just sat there for a second, listening. I don't get visitors often, especially not that late. My first thought was maybe it was a neighbor needing something. But when I peeked out the window, the porch light was on, and I didn't see anyone. The rain was coming down in sheets, so I figured whoever it was had already left. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder. My heart started racing. I went to the door and checked the peephole, but no one was there. The porch was empty. I even opened the door slightly to look around, but all I could see was the rain pouring down in my empty driveway. Feeling uneasy, I locked the door, double-checked all the windows, and tried to convince myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. Maybe a branch or something was hitting the house. I went back to the couch, but I couldn't relax. Every sound the house made put me on edge. About 15 minutes later, I heard it again, but this time it wasn't at the front door. It was coming from the back of the house, specifically the door that leads to my backyard. My body went numb. There's no way someone could have gotten back there without me noticing. The side gate is locked, and my yard is surrounded by a high fence. I grabbed my phone and texted a friend just to feel a little less alone. I didn't tell them what was happening, though. I didn't want to sound paranoid. Then I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the back door. The knocking stopped before I got there. I turned on the light for the backyard, but all I could see through the window was the rain hitting the patio. There was no one there. I stood there for a while, just staring out into the dark, wondering if I was losing my mind. And then I saw it. A set of muddy footprints on the patio, leading right up to the door. I froze. Whoever had been knocking wasn't gone. They were out there, somewhere, in the rain. I didn't know what to do. Calling the police felt like overkill since technically no crime had been committed. Instead, I turned off the lights, locked myself in my bedroom, and sat there with my knife and my phone, trying to stay calm. About an hour passed without anything else happening, and I finally started to relax. Maybe they had given up and left. But just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it wasn't coming from the doors. It was coming from my bedroom window. I didn't look. I couldn't. I just sat there, frozen, hoping they couldn't see me through the curtains. After what felt like forever, the knocking stopped. I waited in silence, barely breathing, until the first light of morning started to creep in through the blinds. When I finally got the courage to check outside, there were muddy footprints all around the house, at the front door, the back door, and every single window. Whoever it was had been circling my house, watching, waiting. But what really freaked me out was the set of footprints leading away from my bedroom window. They didn't go to the gate or the street. They just disappeared into the woods behind my house. I reported it to the police, but they couldn't do much. besides file a report. They said it was probably someone trying to scare me or maybe even casing the house for a break-in. They recommended installing cameras, which I did the very next day. I haven't had anything like that happen again, but every time it rains at night, I can't help but feel like someone's out there, watching. This happened about 3 weeks ago, and I'm still trying to process how close I came to missing it entirely. I live alone in a small 2-story house just outside the city. It's nothing fancy, but I've always liked having my own space. That night it was pouring rain, the kind where the gutters overflow and everything feels heavy and damp. I'd just gotten home from work, exhausted, and was ready to settle in for the evening. I went through my usual routine, heated up some leftovers, threw on a hoodie, and curled up on the couch to watch Netflix. The rain was hammering against the windows, and I remember thinking how cozy it felt being inside while the storm raged outside. About an hour in, I started hearing noises. At first, it was faint, just the creaking of the old house, which I'm used to. But then it became more distinct, like footsteps upstairs. I paused the show and listened, but the sound stopped. I figured it was just the storm messing with the house and went back to watching. A little while later, I heard it again. This time it was louder. Footsteps, clear as day, coming from upstairs. My heart sank. I live alone, and I don't have pets, so there shouldn't have been anyone up there. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was walking back and forth. I grabbed my phone and stood at the bottom of the staircase, staring up into the dark hallway. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing. Just the sound of the rain and my own breathing. I should have called the police right then, but a part of me still thought I was overreacting. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way upstairs, my heart pounding. When I reached the top, everything looked normal. The doors to the bedrooms were closed, just as I'd left them. I checked each room one by one, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The guest room was empty. The bathroom was empty. Finally, I opened the door to my bedroom. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The closet door was open, just a crack. I know for a fact I had closed it earlier that day because I always do. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the door, trying to work up the courage to check inside. Finally, I swung it open and shined the flashlight inside. It was empty. I felt a wave of relief, but something still didn't feel right. I decided to go back downstairs and call a friend to come over just to be safe. As I turned to leave the room, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The attic hatch in the ceiling was slightly ajar. I didn't even think. I ran out of the room and down the stairs, locking myself in the bathroom with my phone. I called the police and tried to explain what was happening. They said they'd send someone over and told me to stay put. When the officers arrived, they searched the house, including the attic. That's when they found it. There was a small setup in the attic. Blankets, water bottles, and a backpack stuffed with clothes and snacks. Someone had been living up there. They must have been using the rain and the noise of the storm to mask their movements, but I'd caught on just in time. The officers said it looked like the person had left recently, probably when they heard me calling for help. The police didn't catch whoever it was, but they did find a ladder hidden in the bushes outside, leading up to a window in the guest room. That's how they'd been getting in and out. I still don't know how long they'd been up there or what they wanted, but the thought of someone watching me, listening to me, while I went about my life, it's enough to make my skin crawl. I've since installed cameras and new locks, but I still check the attic hatch every night before I go to bed. Rainy nights will never feel cozy again. I've never been someone who scares easily, but this experience shook me to my core. It happened 2 months ago on a rainy Friday night, and I can't stop thinking about how close I came to just ignoring the signs. I live in a duplex on the edge of town. My neighbors are quiet, and I've always liked how peaceful it feels. My half of the house has a basement I rarely use. It's mostly storage and laundry down there, and since it's damp and musty, I don't spend much time in it. That detail becomes important later. That night, the rain was coming down in sheets, and I was stuck inside. I had planned to meet some friends, but the weather was so bad that I decided to stay home and watch movies instead. Around 9 p.m., I heard a faint thud coming from somewhere in the house. It wasn't loud, more like something heavy had shifted. At first, I assumed it was just the wind or the house settling. It's an old building, so weird noises aren't unusual. I went back to my movie, but about 30 minutes later I heard it again. Another thud, louder this time, like something had been dropped. This time I muted the TV and listened carefully. The sound seemed to be coming from below me. My stomach tightened as I realized it was coming from the basement. I hadn't been down there in weeks, but the idea of something falling on its own didn't sit right with me. I told myself it was probably just something tipping over, a broom, a box, but I couldn't shake the unease. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the basement door. The stairs creaked as I descended, and the air grew colder with each step. I shined the flashlight around, expecting to see some harmless explanation, like a box that had toppled over. But everything was where I'd left it. The shelves were intact, the tools hung neatly on the wall, and nothing seemed out of place. I was just about to head back upstairs when I noticed something strange. A faint, muddy footprint on the concrete floor, leading toward the far corner of the basement. I froze. There was no reason for mud to be there. I hadn't been outside, and no one else had access to the house. My heart was pounding as I followed the footprints with the flashlight. They led to a dark corner where an old utility closet stood, the door slightly ajar. At this point, I wanted to run. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there, but something pushed me to keep going. I reached for the closet door and pulled it open slowly, holding my breath. Inside was a small man hunched over with his knees tucked to his chest. His clothes were filthy, and his hair was matted. He looked up at me, wide-eyed, like I was the intruder. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds, the silence broken only by the sound of rain pounding on the basement windows. "What the hell are you doing here?" I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. I didn't mean any harm," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "I just needed a place to stay." I backed up, keeping the flashlight pointed at him. "Get out." "Now," I said, trying to sound firm despite the fear in my voice. The man didn't move. "Please," he said, almost whispering. "Just let me stay until the rain stops." I didn't wait. I bolted up the stairs, slammed the basement door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I called the police, explaining what I'd found. They arrived quickly and went down to check the basement. When they brought him out, he looked defeated, like he wasn't even trying to fight back. The police found a sleeping bag, food wrappers, and even a small lantern tucked into the utility closet. It looked like he'd been living there for weeks, maybe even months, without me knowing. Here's the part that still gives me chills. The police told me he'd made copies of my house key. They found the originals and duplicates in his backpack. When I asked how he got them, he admitted he'd stolen them from my mailbox, He'd been watching me for who knows how long, waiting for the right moment. I've since changed all my locks and installed cameras, but I still feel uneasy in my own home. Every creak and thud makes my heart race, and I can't bring myself to go down to the basement alone, knowing someone was living down there, watching me while I went about my life. It's a kind of fear I wouldn't wish on anyone. This happened last fall on a rainy night, and it still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. I live alone in a small house on a quiet street, not too far from the city. It's not isolated or anything, but the houses are far enough apart that if you scream, it's 50-50 whether anyone will hear you. That night, it was raining hard, and I was enjoying the sound of it while I settled in to watch some TV. I just ordered takeout and was waiting for the driver to arrive. My house has a front porch with one of those old creaky wooden floors, and I remember thinking how eerie the rain sounded bouncing off it. At around 8 p.m., I got a notification that my food had been delivered. I went to the front door, opened it, and found the bag sitting on the mat. Nothing unusual. The driver had left without knocking, which was fine by me. But as I bent down to pick up the bag, I caught a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, something under the porch. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or a stray cat. The rain can mess with your depth perception, and the light on my porch wasn't great. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy as I stepped back inside and locked the door. I ate my dinner and tried to push the thought out of my mind. But the rain seemed louder now, like it was amplifying every little noise outside. Every once in a while I thought I heard something, a faint scraping sound, like wood being dragged across wood. I turned up the volume on the TV, trying to drown it out, but it wasn't working. Finally, I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight, threw on my rain jacket, and opened the front door. The rain was freezing as I stepped onto the porch, shining the flashlight down at the floorboards. The light cut through the gaps between them, and for a second, I thought I saw something. A shadow, or maybe a pair of feet. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. My voice was swallowed by the rain. I leaned down, shining the flashlight into the crawl space under the porch. At first, all I could see were cobwebs and dirt. But then, about 6 feet back, I saw him. A man crouched under the porch, his face partially hidden by his hood. His clothes were soaked, and he was staring right at me. I froze. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he smiled, a slow, chilling grin that made my blood run cold. "What are you doing down there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he started crawling toward me, dragging himself through the mud like he had all the time in the world. I bolted back inside, slamming the door and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The operator told me to stay on the line and keep the doors locked until the police arrived. I didn't have to wait long. Within 10 minutes, 2 officers were at my door. I explained what had happened, and they went outside to check. When they came back, they said there was no one under the porch, but they found clear signs that someone had been there. Muddy handprints on the beams and deep grooves in the dirt where he'd been crawling. They searched the area but didn't find him. The officers told me it was probably a transient looking for shelter, but the way he acted, the way he smiled, it felt more deliberate, more sinister. I didn't sleep that night, and for weeks after I kept thinking I heard noises outside, even when it wasn't raining. I don't know what he wanted or why he was there, but every time it rains, I can't help but imagine him still out there, watching, waiting for the next porch to crawl under. I've lived alone for about 2 years now, and I've never really been the type to get scared easily. But after this night, I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe in my own home again. It was a rainy Thursday night, and I had the perfect setup: a blanket, tea, and a true crime documentary playing in the background while I worked on my laptop. My house isn't big, just a one-story bungalow with a lot of windows, which I usually love because it makes the space feel open. But that night, the rain and the darkness outside turned those windows into something else. Black mirrors that reflected my living room back at me. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I turned off the TV, locked the front door, and checked all the windows like I always do. The rain was coming down hard, and the sound of it hitting the roof was oddly soothing. As I turned off the kitchen light, I thought I saw something move outside through the corner of my eye. Just a quick flicker of motion near the window. I told myself it was just the rain playing tricks on me. Still, I stood there for a moment, staring out into the dark backyard, trying to see past the water streaking down the glass. Nothing. Just the faint outline of my shed and the tall wooden fence beyond it. Shaking it off, I went to bed, but I couldn't relax. Every little creak of the house or gust of wind had me glancing at the door. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous. It's just a stormy night, nothing unusual. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the living room. I froze, my heart racing. It wasn't the kind of sound rain makes, and it wasn't the normal groaning of the house. It was deliberate. Tap, 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 like someone was gently knocking on the window. I grabbed my phone and crept down the hallway, trying to keep quiet. The tapping continued, steady and unhurried. When I reached the living room, I stayed back, hidden in the shadows, and peeked toward the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a face pressed against the glass, a man's face, pale and wet, with dark, sunken eyes. His lips were stretched into a wide grin, and his breath fogged up the window as he stared inside. He didn't knock or move. He just stood there, grinning, watching. I don't know how long I stood frozen, staring back at him. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few seconds. Finally, I snapped out of it and ducked behind the couch. My hands were shaking as I called 911, whispering into the phone so he wouldn't hear me. The operator told me to stay on the line and stay hidden. The police were on their way. As I sat there, clutching my phone, I heard the sound of footsteps moving around the house, slow, deliberate, like he was walking along the perimeter, checking the windows. At one point, I swear I heard the back door handle jiggle. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, though it felt like an eternity. By the time they searched the property, the man was gone. They found muddy footprints outside every window and a clear handprint smeared on the glass where he'd been standing. The worst part? They told me the rain had likely washed away any other evidence, including where he might have gone. The officers said it was probably an attempted burglary, but I don't buy it. He didn't try to break in when he had the chance. He didn't take anything. He just watched, like he enjoyed knowing I was inside, scared and helpless. I installed cameras the next day, and I've never felt comfortable in that house again. Every time it rains, I find myself staring out the windows, half expecting to see that face again, grinning at me from the dark. I wasn't supposed to be home that night. My roommate, Tara, had invited me to a party, but I'd been feeling under the weather and decided to stay in. She left around 8 p.m., and I settled in with some tea, a blanket, and a book, listening to the rain drum against the windows. It was the kind of rain that made the streets empty and the world feel smaller, like you were the only person around. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing noises. At first, it was just the creaking of the house, normal stuff. But then there was something else, a faint but distinct thud near the front door. My first thought was that Tara had forgotten something and come back. I called out, "Tara?" but got no response. I walked to the front door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just the rain-soaked porch and the dark street beyond. I locked the deadbolt, even though I already had, and went back to the couch, telling myself it was probably just the wind knocking something over. 15 minutes later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just a thud. It was the unmistakable sound of someone trying the doorknob. My stomach dropped. I crept back to the door and checked the peephole again, but there was still no one there. My heart was racing as I stood there, listening to the rain and the faint click-click of the knob being jiggled. I grabbed my phone and texted Tara, asking if she'd come back earlier or if someone had stopped by. She replied almost instantly, "Nope. Still at the party." Why? That's when I noticed it. A single wet handprint on the glass panel of the front door, right at eye level. It hadn't been there earlier, and it wasn't mine or Tara's. We hadn't gone outside all day. The sight of it made my chest tighten. Someone had been at the door watching. I didn't want to make a big deal out of nothing, so I turned off all the lights in the house, grabbed a kitchen knife, and sat on the floor in the hallway where I couldn't be seen. I was too scared to call the police at that point, convincing myself it could have been a prank, or maybe even a delivery driver who got the wrong house. About an hour later, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It was at the sliding glass door in the kitchen. My breath caught as I crawled toward the kitchen, staying low to avoid being seen through the windows. The blinds on the slider were partially open, just enough for me to see outside. At first, I didn't see anything, just the rain pouring down and the faint reflection of the room behind me. Then he stepped into view. A man, drenched from head to toe, was standing just outside the glass, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. He didn't knock, didn't try the door handle. He just stood there, staring through the gap in the blinds like he could see me. I scrambled back to the hallway, my hands shaking as I finally dialed 911. The dispatcher was calm, asking me to stay on the line and keep quiet until the police arrived. I could barely hear her over the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 10 minutes before I saw the flashing lights outside. By the time the officers reached the back door, the man was gone. They searched the yard and the street, but didn't find him. What they did find, though, still haunts me. There were wet footprints all around the house, leading from the front door to the kitchen, and even to my bedroom window. Whoever he was, he'd been circling the house, watching me. The handprint on the front door was just the beginning. The police assured me he was probably a drifter or someone looking for an easy target, but that explanation didn't make me feel any better. I haven't stayed home alone on a rainy night since, and every time I see a handprint on glass, I feel that same chill run down my spine. This happened about 6 months ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. It was one of those stormy nights where the rain just doesn't let up, and the sound of it pounding on the windows made the house feel smaller and eerily quiet. I live alone in a small one-bedroom rental. That night, I was feeling restless, so I decided to take a hot shower to relax. The sound of the water mixed with the rain outside was oddly calming, and for a little while I forgot about how on edge I'd been all day. I was halfway through rinsing my hair when I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the pipes groaning, but then I realized it was coming from inside the bathroom. a faint, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. I froze, water dripping down my face, and strained to listen. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from just beyond the shower curtain. My heart was racing, but I told myself it had to be my imagination. Maybe the storm was messing with my senses. Maybe the sound of the rain was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. Slow, deep breaths, as if someone was standing right on the other side of the curtain. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the sink, just out of reach. My brain was screaming at me to grab it, to call someone, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Instead, I stood there, water running, trying to convince myself I wasn't crazy. Finally, I worked up the courage to speak. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. My hand moved slowly to the edge of the curtain, and I yanked it open in one swift motion, expecting to see, well, something. But the bathroom was empty. The door was closed, just as I'd left it, and there was no one there. I let out a shaky laugh, telling myself I was being ridiculous. I turned off the water, grabbed a towel, and stepped out of the shower. That's when I noticed it. The bathroom mirror was fogged up from the steam, except for one spot near the bottom. There, clear as day, were streaks. Long, finger-shaped streaks, where someone had wiped it clean. I froze. I hadn't touched the mirror. I couldn't even reach that low without bending down. And I definitely hadn't done that. My stomach dropped as I realized what it meant. Someone had been in the bathroom while I was in the shower. I grabbed my phone and backed out of the bathroom, locking myself in the bedroom and calling 911. I tried to explain what had happened, but I felt like I sounded crazy. How do you tell someone you think you heard breathing and found fingerprints on a foggy mirror without sounding paranoid? The police arrived about 15 minutes later and searched the house. They didn't find anyone, but the back door was unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it earlier, but I guess I could have forgotten. At least, that's what I told myself to feel better. Here's the part that still haunts me, though. The officer who checked the bathroom pulled me aside before leaving. "You're lucky you called us," he said. Whoever it was must have left in a hurry. We found muddy footprints leading away from the house. I moved out of that place 2 weeks later. I couldn't stay there, not knowing someone had been inside while I was vulnerable, watching me. Now, every time I step into the shower, I can't help but check the curtain first. And I always make sure the mirrors stay foggy, just in case. This happened last fall during a relentless rainstorm. I'd just gotten back from a long day at work, completely drenched from running from my car to the house. The rain was coming down so hard it was bouncing off the pavement, and the gutters were overflowing. It was one of those nights where you just want to curl up and ignore the world. I kicked off my soaked shoes by the front door and went straight to the kitchen to make some tea. As I was waiting for the water to boil, I heard a faint thud coming from somewhere in the house. I froze, listening. It wasn't the usual creaking of the old house or the rain hammering on the windows. It was something heavier, more deliberate. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But as I stepped into the hallway, my stomach sank. There, on the floor, was a fresh set of muddy boot prints leading from the back door into the living room. Here's the thing. I don't own boots. The logical part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe I'd left the door unlocked and the storm blew it open. But I checked the back door and it was shut and locked. My mind raced as I followed the muddy prints, trying not to panic. They led straight to the living room, then stopped in front of the couch. No one was there. The room was empty. The only sound was the rain pounding on the windows, but the boots, whoever had worn them, had been standing right there in front of my couch. My skin prickled as I noticed a small puddle of water on the rug. It was like whoever it was had been standing there, watching, and then... what? Disappeared? I turned on every light in the house and checked all the rooms, even the closets. Nothing. No sign of anyone. I cleaned up the muddy footprints, trying to calm myself down. Maybe they'd been there before I got home, and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. I almost convinced myself of that until I saw the boots again. I was heading to bed, still rattled, when I noticed something in the corner of my bedroom. Sitting there, perfectly still, was a pair of old muddy boots. They weren't mine, and I had no idea how they got there. My heart felt like it stopped as I realized they were positioned as if someone had stepped out of them and left them there. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I grabbed my keys, ran to my car, and drove to a friend's house. I called the police, who checked the house and told me they didn't find anything suspicious. They thought it was some kind of prank, or that I'd imagined it because of the storm. But I know what I saw. The boots were gone when I got back, and no one's been able to explain what happened that night. Now, every time it rains, I check every lock and window twice. I still get chills thinking about those muddy prints and the boots sitting silently in the corner like they were waiting for me to notice. This happened about a year ago on one of those nights where the rain just wouldn't let up. It had been pouring all evening, and by the time night rolled around, everything outside was soaked and shrouded in darkness. I live alone in a small house with a decent-sized backyard that backs up to a wooded area. Normally it's peaceful, but that night it felt different. I was in the kitchen making dinner, enjoying the sound of the rain on the roof, when I got this sudden, inexplicable feeling that I was being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia, but it was strong enough that I glanced out the kitchen window. At first, all I saw was the rain streaming down the glass and the faint outline of the trees in the distance. But then I noticed something. Someone was standing just inside the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. I froze, my eyes locked on the figure. They weren't moving, just standing there facing the house. My first thought was that it had to be one of the neighbors, maybe someone cutting through the woods. But why would anyone be out there in this weather? I turned off the lights in the kitchen to get a better look, hoping the darkness would make it harder for them to see me. When my eyes adjusted, I saw them more clearly. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing completely still. He wasn't holding an umbrella or wearing a raincoat. He was just letting the rain drench him. I grabbed my phone and considered calling the police, but what was I supposed to say? Hi, there's a guy standing in the woods behind my house. They'd probably tell me he wasn't doing anything wrong. Instead, I decided to wait it out, hoping he'd leave. But he didn't. He stayed there, unmoving, for what felt like hours. I tried to convince myself it wasn't as creepy as it seemed. Maybe he was a hiker who'd gotten lost, or someone waiting for the rain to ease up. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Around 11 p.m., I checked again. He was gone. I felt a wave of relief, thinking he'd finally moved on. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Muddy footprints leading from the woods to the edge of my backyard. They stopped just short of the patio, as if he'd been standing there, watching me through the window before retreating into the trees. I locked every door and window in the house and went to bed, still feeling uneasy. The rain finally started to let up around midnight, and I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. A soft knock at the back door. I froze, my heart pounding. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. I crept to the back door, staying out of sight, and listened. The rain had quieted down enough that I could hear faint breathing on the other side of the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police. While I waited, the knocking stopped, but the sense of dread didn't. I sat there clutching a kitchen knife, staring at the door, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived, they found fresh footprints circling the house. They told me it was probably someone trying to scare me, but they couldn't find him. I spent the rest of the night at a friend's house and installed security cameras the next day. The footage has never shown anything suspicious since, but I still check it obsessively whenever it rains. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for another stormy night to come back. This happened about a year ago, and even though everything turned out okay in the end, I still get chills just thinking about it. I live in a small house in a quiet suburb, the kind of neighborhood where you never expect anything bad to happen. That night, the rain was coming down hard, drowning out every other sound. I was home alone, sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through my phone when I thought I heard something. At first, I brushed it off as the storm, the rain hitting the windows, maybe the wind shaking the trees. But then I heard it again, a faint click from the front door, like someone was testing the lock. I froze, my stomach doing flips. I always lock my doors, but I still got up to check. The front door was locked, just like I thought. But as I turned to head back to the kitchen, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The back door creaked open. I panicked. I didn't even think to grab a weapon or try to confront whoever it was. Instead, I ran to my bedroom, locked the door, and hid in the closet, clutching my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911 and whispered to the operator what was happening. She told me to stay on the line and stay hidden until the police arrived. As I sat there, I heard the intruder moving through the house. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate. Drawers opening and slamming shut. The sound of things being knocked over. My heart was racing so hard I thought it would give me away. At one point, I heard him try the door to my bedroom. The doorknob jiggled and I held my breath, praying he wouldn't try to force it open. After a few tense seconds, he moved on. I could hear him rummaging through the living room, throwing things around, clearly looking for something valuable. It felt like hours, but it was probably only about 10 minutes before the house went silent. The operator reassured me that the police were close, but those minutes waiting felt like an eternity. I stayed hidden, barely breathing, until I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. When the police arrived, the intruder was gone. My house was a mess. Drawers pulled out, furniture overturned, and a few things missing. But I was safe, and that's what mattered. The officers took my statement and promised to do everything they could to find the guy. A few days later, they called me with an update. They'd caught him. Turns out he was a career criminal with a long history of break-ins. He'd been targeting homes in my neighborhood for weeks, waiting for nights like that rainy one when people would be less likely to notice someone sneaking around. Now he's serving time, and I'm grateful every day that I had the presence of mind to hide instead of confronting him. But even knowing he's behind bars, I still double-check every lock and window before I go to bed. That night changed the way I think about my home. It's supposed to feel safe. But now, every little noise has me on edge, especially when it rains. This happened a couple of months ago, and I can't stop thinking about how much worse it could have been. I was home alone on a rainy Friday night. The rain was coming down hard, and the wind was rattling the windows. It was one of those nights where being inside felt cozy, and I'd just finished a cup of tea while watching a movie. Around 10 p.m., I was cleaning up the kitchen when I heard a loud crash from the living room. It was so sudden and violent that I froze, my heart racing. For a split second, I thought it was thunder. But then I heard the sound of glass shattering. I peeked around the corner, and my stomach dropped. The front window was completely smashed, and a large rock was lying on the floor amid shards of glass. My brain was still processing what had happened when I saw him. A man climbing through the broken window, his soaked hoodie clinging to him as he struggled to pull himself inside. I panicked. My first instinct was to run. But something about seeing someone invade my home filled me with rage instead of fear. Without thinking, I yelled at him as loud as I could. "What the hell are you doing? Get out of my house!" He froze, his eyes wide. He looked like he hadn't expected anyone to be home. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy ceramic vase from the entryway table, and started charging toward him, adrenaline coursing through me. He scrambled back, slipping on the wet glass as he tried to climb back out. "I'm sorry," he yelled, his voice panicked. "I thought no one was here." By the time I reached the window, he was already running off into the rain. I stood there, breathing hard, watching him disappear into the darkness. My hands were shaking, and I didn't realize until later that I was still clutching the vase. I locked the front door, grabbed my phone, and called the police. They arrived within minutes and took my statement. The officers told me I'd done the right thing by yelling and scaring him off, but they also warned me not to confront someone like that again. "You don't know what they're capable of," one of them said. "Next time, call us first." They didn't find the guy that night, but a few days later they called to tell me they'd arrested someone matching the description. He'd been breaking into homes in the area, targeting houses where the lights were off, and it looked like no one was home. The rock through the window was his way of testing if the place was empty. Since then, I've installed cameras and reinforced the locks on all my doors and windows. But I still get jumpy whenever I hear a noise at night, especially when it's raining. I keep replaying the moment I saw him climbing through the window, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't yelled, or if he hadn't run. It was one of those nights where the rain felt endless, the kind of steady, heavy downpour that made you grateful to be indoors. I was home alone, enjoying the sound of the storm while curled up with a book. It was peaceful in a way, just me, the rain, and the occasional creak of the house settling. At around 10 p.m., I got up to make some tea. My kitchen window faces the front yard, and as I waited for the water to boil, I glanced outside. The porch light was on, illuminating the rain-soaked steps, and that's when I noticed it, an umbrella leaning against the side of the house. I froze. I don't own an umbrella like that. It was one of those old-fashioned kinds, with a curved wooden handle and a black canopy. The rain had made it slick and shiny, and it definitely hadn't been there earlier. My first thought was maybe someone had left it by mistake, but who would have been on my porch in this weather? I walked to the front door, cautiously peeking through the peephole. The porch was empty, and the street beyond was dark and deserted. No movement, no sounds except the rain. I opened the door a crack, just enough to stick my head out, and looked around. Nothing. The umbrella was still leaning there, as though someone had placed it deliberately. Uneasy, I brought it inside, thinking I'd move it out of the way and deal with it later. As I set it in the corner by the coat rack, I noticed something else. A single muddy footprint on the porch, just outside the door. It was large, probably a man's, and the edges were smeared like whoever left it had been standing there for a while. My stomach was in knots. I closed and locked the door, double-checking it just to be sure. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't a big deal. Maybe a delivery driver had gotten caught in the storm, or someone had taken shelter on the porch. But the unease wouldn't go away. About an hour later, I heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from the back door. It wasn't loud, barely audible over the rain, but it was steady and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I crept toward the door, heart pounding, and peeked out through the blinds. Nothing. The backyard was empty, just rain and shadows. But the tapping continued. It wasn't coming from the door itself. It was the window next to it. Slowly, I edged closer, my hands trembling as I lifted the corner of the blind. That's when I saw it. A man was standing just outside the window, his face mainly covered by black hood. He was drenched, water dripping off him, and in his hand he held another umbrella, just like the one I'd brought inside. I gasped and stumbled back, my heart racing. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the house, the umbrella held tightly in his hand. I was unsure if this was a sick joke someone was playing or something sinister. Either way, I didn't care. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering to the operator that someone was outside my house. As I talked, I peeked out the blinds again. He was gone. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. They searched the property but didn't find anyone. The officer who checked the backyard told me the grass was flattened in several spots, as though someone had been walking around watching the house. I didn't sleep that night. Every time the rain hit the windows, I thought I heard footsteps. The next day, I threw the umbrella away, but I still can't shake the feeling that whoever left it will come back someday.